Chinese and U.S. negotiators finished 2 days of talks on Tuesday aimed at tackling long-standing economic disputes, with both sides stepping back from an escalating trade war between the world's two largest economies. CGTN's Ken Brown has more from Stockholm.
Well, talks have concluded here in Stockholm between China and the United States, with another extension agreed in principle to conduct further negotiations. The delegation spoke from around 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. at the Swedish Prime Minister's residence right here behind me, and then they both held press conferences. No major breakthroughs were announced, no done deals of the likes that we've already seen with Great Britain, Japan, and most recently the European Union.
Over
the last day and a half, the trade and economic teams of China and the United States have followed the important consensus reached by the two heads of state, China and the United States, in their June the 5th phone call, continued to give great play to the role of the China-U.S. trade and economic consultation mechanism, and had in-depth, candid, and constructive exchanges over important topics.
Well, then we heard from the U.S. side. Lead Scott Bessent called it a couple of pleasant days in Stockholm. His overall tone was pretty positive, but he was short on the details. An extension has been agreed in principle, but how long has not been confirmed. Further tariffs were suggested of around 34%, which could take tariffs on U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods up to around 80 to 85% on August 12th, when the deadline for a deal expired. Bessent then said, when he was pushed, he said that 90 days was the most likely outcome there, but that he needs to speak with U.S. President Donald Trump. China said that its energy policy was part of its sovereignty, and that its sovereignty was non-negotiable. Now, as to a meeting between the two leaders of the two countries, President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump, that was asked at the press conference here today, but no answer was given. They said that the issue simply didn't come up. U.S. President Donald Trump has talked about that. He suggested that a meeting could potentially happen between or before the end of the year. Ken Brown, CGTN, Stockholm.
There is certainly a lot to talk about, so let's get right to our panel. Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with the Institute for China-America Studies. Liang is a chair professor in economics at Willamette University. Also with us is John Tamny. He heads the Parkview Institute and is an editor for Real Clear Markets. And Victor Gao is chair professor at Soochow University. Victor, why don't I start with you, China's international trade representative, saying that the two sides had candid exchanges. Back in the day, you sat in on these big meetings, high-level talks, which would go on for quite some time. No breakthrough here, but what do you read into what he's saying there? How do you decipher it?
Thank you very much for having me. I think the news, or the lack of news, from Stockholm had two dimensions to it. One is that China and the United States have channels and have mechanisms to engage with each other in very high level, very intimate and very sensitive discussions. That in itself is a very positive step forward. Secondly, there is another dimension, that is, after the discussions in Geneva, after London, now after Stockholm, the two sides have not yet reached an agreement. Now, this level of uncertainty is still very much nerve-wracking, and how much time it will take and what will be the final decision of the two heads of state in China and in the United States is still not known. And the fact that the United States apparently have brought in other extraneous things into the discussions in Stockholm, including, for example, China's import of oil and gas from Russia on the one hand and from Iran on the other hand, and China's stern position on this point, have also raised a concern about whether eventually some agreement will be reached. Suffice it to say, the meeting was a good one. There was no breakup of dialogue, for example, and it seems that more efforts need to be made, and eventually the whole world will really settle down with a great relief, for example, if Beijing and Washington can really declare that they reached some kind of agreement which will be acceptable by both China and the United States, and then the rest of the world will decide to move on rather than being burdened by this uncertainty of lack of agreement between these two largest economies in the world.
Yan Liang, we're still living in the nerve-wracking phase, as Victor Gao so eloquently put it. According to China's International Trade Representative Li Chonggong, both sides reportedly satisfied with what happened with the implementation of the Geneva and London consensus. It looks like there's an extension. At least that's what we're hearing, although, of course, it all hinges on whether or not Donald Trump agrees to that. Talk to us about what we can expect in terms of an extension, in terms of more length of time, and what do you see as the major stumbling blocks still standing in the way of an agreement?
Yeah, good to be with you, Mike. So I think it's quite predictable that this very complex trade negotiations are going to take longer. If you remember the phase one, it took about 1.5 years to really reach a phase one deal. So this time around, with more complicated issues, with more asks from the United States, it is quite expected that these kinds of trade negotiations are going to take longer. So I agree with Victor. I think the fact that these high-level negotiations are going on and expected to go on more, I think that's a good sign. And in terms of the stumbling block, I think, for one is, as Victor just put it, that there are some kinds of interference, I think, from the United States when it comes to China's trade policies, whether or not China purchase, quote unquote, the sanctioned oil from Iran and Russia. That's one sticking point. Other ones, Besson mentioned in his press conference something about pulling back China's so-called, glut manufacturing capacity. I think that is another point where China, in principle, would agree that it wants to pivot its economy towards more of a consumption-led economy, but it does not want the United States to point fingers at China's own domestic policies. Other ones, I think, when it comes to the export sort of restrictions or control on rare earths, that is, again, China considered as a national sovereignty issue. It is its own, strategic interest. So I think when it comes to those issues, it would be difficult to resolve in a very short amount of time. But on other issues, such as energy purchases from the United States, for example, I think there's room for China to make some concessions on that. Like, EU and Japan has agreed with large numbers of energy purchases. China may be able to do that, given its very low base right now. The imports of 3 types of energies from the United States to China in June is pretty much flat, it's 0. So I think there are some ways for China to increase the purchases of agricultural products or energy products. But in exchange, I think China would really ask the United States to lower the tariffs, especially the fentanyl-related, 20% tariffs, as well as, I think, other issues such as the especially other issues also, such as the the tech restrictions. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese firms on the blacklisted. I think that's one thing that China would like to talk about in the future negotiations. I expect that extensions will be granted upon the final approval of Donald Trump.
Sourabh Gupta, an editorial published in China Daily, stated, quote, China firmly opposes the use of unilateralism and protectionism to undermine the multilateral trading system. So China's endeavor to reach a fair deal with the U.S. through talks also represents its contribution to a rules-based world trade order. Of course, we know President Trump has been slapping tariffs here and there, highest level since before the Second World War. What do you make of Trump's tariff policy at this stage?
Let's start right at the beginning. That the tariffs that he is imposing are illegal. They are WTO illegal. The U.S. is not standing by treaty law in terms of the tariffs that it's going to impose. But the fact of the matter is that the U.S. is such a big country, such an important consumer, that, well, it's doing what it is doing, and the other countries are having to swallow what it needs to swallow. And they're negotiating with the U.S. Nobody is happy about this. Australia, EU, Japan, nobody. In fact, I mean, the allies and partners are even more upset about it. But what China is alluding to, I think, partly out here is, okay, if the U.S. is stepping out of this game, at least the rest of the world must continue to abide by rules-based standards in the International Trade and Investment Order. At least in that way, stability will be maintained. After all, the U.S. is important, but it is one player, an important player, while the rest of the world is a very significant economic player, especially the EU, Japan, and China, and if they maintain those rules will stand, and there will be deeper integration. I think the second point the Chinese are also alluding to is that other third parties, say the EU, UK, Japan, should not take WTO inconsistent measures against China in the name of appeasing the US. You know, in the last administration, Mr. Biden got the Canadians and the Mexicans, the Canadians particular, to match the US tariff on EVs against China, take the Canadian tariff also up to 100%. Yes, the US's tariffs were illegal, but the Canadians also put themselves at the forefront of illegality in their dealings with China. And therefore, I think China is alluding to third countries that they must abide by WTO rules in their relations with China, no matter what they sign with the US in their bilateral agreements with them.
And John, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent gave a real positive assessment of the latest talks, describing them as far-reaching, robust, and highly satisfactory. He talked to CNBC where he said, you know, he's urging China to shift their economy toward a consumer-based model rather than manufacturing, which of course our guests have alluded to. What do you make of that? And I think if the shoe was on the other foot and China came in and insisted you need to change your economy, people might be howling. So I want to get your thoughts on this.
Well, it's a great point, because what Treasury Secretary Bessent is saying is fallacious. To produce is to consume. China exports because it wants to import. And so the idea that it would change what makes it such a successful consumer around the world to somehow improve the world defies basic economics, which is why I sense that I think the actual conversations behind the scenes were far more peaceful than the ones publicly. And the reason why I think is basic. Let's face it, Apple sells 1/5 of its iPhones in China. Tesla sells 40% of its cars in China. GM sells more cars in China than it does in North America. Nike sells more shoes in China than any other country but America. There's 5,500 McDonald's in America. The U.S. economy is very much reliant on China's economy. Conversely, precisely because of that, China's economy is very much reliant on the U.S.'s. I think underlying all this talk and pushback and everything is the recognition among the people there that the U.S. and China can't progress, they can't get richer and richer without each other. And so while we will talk about trade in political ways publicly to feed the flocks in both countries, behind the scenes we will talk reality, and reality is both countries must keep their markets open to one another if they want to continue to prosper.
John, let's talk about reality and perception, which there's two different avenues there. I mean, obviously, the reality with the EU is they wanted to make a deal with Trump. You've got all these different countries. Some want this, some want that. So they come to this agreement. A lot of people grousing about the EU deal. China's a different story altogether. But the perception, a lot of these deals are people caving to Trump. So there's this built-in kind of narrative that, oh, they caved. But China is coming at it with a much more, I think, strategic point of view. As you point out, the U.S. needs a lot more of what China has to offer, including rare earth minerals.
Oh, absolutely it does. I mean, you look at NVIDIA, the most valuable company in the world right now, much of what it produces, it can't produce without inputs coming from China. And so, and this is a beautiful thing, that the U.S. and China are very much interconnected in this way. What I wish we could have gotten from President Trump from the beginning was, hey, guess what, world, we're going to zero. And if you don't follow us to zero, you're going to fall further and further behind us. Which is why I think the rest of the world, the way they should push back against Trump is say, you are injuring your people by imposing tariffs. You used to basically be Hong Kong, but now you're moving away from that. So we will move to zero, not to placate you, but because that's what rich countries do. They take in the world's plenty so that their people can focus on what they do best at all times. There's only one good tariff, and it's called zero.
Zero. Victor, let's talk about philosophies and strategies and approaches, because Li Chenggong, China's international trade representative, he's a seasoned veteran when it comes to this. I mean, he started out in 1989 at the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation. He worked as the Chinese representative to the WTO. In an interview with CGTN last year, he pointed out what a proponent he is of multilateralism. Here's a quote. He said, "Trade itself is not the problem. trade should be part of the solution to the problem. That's, of course, the stance not just of him, but of China going forward. But then you have Trump, and he's obviously into protectionism. He feels like the U.S. is getting ripped off by everybody. How do you narrow that gap where you have one philosophy and another philosophy, and they're both sitting down at the table?
First of all, I think free trade is something that the mankind as a whole need to defend and promote. And secondly, the tariff war launched by the United States against not only China, but almost the rest of the world as a whole is the wrong war and is not going to be constructive for anyone in the world. Now, the third point, allow me to emphasize, if President Trump and his government are really serious about moving back some of the manufacturing capacities back to the United States, then China can help rather than be a counterproductive force. But therefore, I think the confusion right now in the world is what exactly the United States want to do and what is its end game. I'm afraid President Trump and his government are a little bit confused, either deliberately or unintentionally, as to what exactly they want to do. Now, allow me to make one very simple point. President Trump has been talking about all these tariffs for all these years, especially since January the 20th, or in particular since April the 2nd. Now, who will pay these tariffs? Fundamentally, all these tariffs that President Trump and his government will charge will be paid by the Americans. It will be paid by the American importers and to be spread around by the American consumers. And eventually, it is kind of an additional tax against the American people. It will not make the American society richer. It will really be a burden on the United States. Therefore, I think from the Chinese perspective, China and the United States being highly integrated with each other, and China, for example, has probably the largest market for the made in American products. And because of China's efficiency and productivity, for example, China can also offer to export to the rest of the world higher quality goods at a greater efficiency, for example. So this is the time for us to really put our thoughts around this issue as to what exactly will be in the best interest of the people in the United States, in the best interest of all the countries in the world. And this is the time that we all need to rise up to the occasion to defend free trade rather than destroying free trade or undermining free trade. Therefore, I think philosophically speaking on the one hand, but also look at the reality of the ground. If we really want to protect the fundamental interests of the people in the United States, protect free trade, open up all countries' markets to each other. If I buy something from you, it's not because you rip me off. If I export something to you, it's not because I want to steal anything from you. Trade should be free, and only free trade will lead to fair trade.
Yan Liang, the previous two meetings held in Geneva and London produced two basic principles. First, a WTO rules-based trade relationship requires the removal of unilateral tariffs. Second, a bilateral trade relationship must be based on equality, mutual respect, and mutual benefit. That used to be standard operating procedure. You really wouldn't have to put that into writing. It also said that both sides had reached a trade agreement framework. So it seems like some of the heavy lifting's been done. How far apart are the sides, and what is the end game, do you think, from the Trump administration?
Well, I think that's a great question. I don't think anyone at this point really understands Trump's rationale in imposing all these tariffs. He himself has talked about many reasons. One is, as Michelle talked about, he sees trade as a zero-sum game. The U.S. has been ripped off, so he wants to impose tariffs. Never mind, the tariffs are actually paid by the American consumers and firms. When you look at the tariffs revenues in June, it jumped to $26.6 billion, which is about 4 times than the euro amount. But again, these tariffs are paid by the Americans. That said, I think Donald Trump is very adamant in raising the tariff revenues to pay for part of his one big beautiful bill. never mind, again, this is paid by the US. And his rhetoric is always, these tariffs are paid by the foreigners. Now, when it comes to the end game, I think another point he wants to do is to bring manufacturing back to the United States, at least, again, in the narrative, in the rhetoric. But we all know, even if there's some revitalization of manufacturing production in the US, it's not going to create more jobs because automation is going to take away many of these manual jobs. I think also trade is really not the culprit for the US's manufacturing decline. That has been going on a long time ago, way before China's WTO accessions, way before China became a manufacturing powerhouse. So I think, again, Donald Trump is talk the talk, but walk the walk. I think he's using the tariffs as a way to really showcase, his power. This is the power that he has without congressional approvals, that he's able to unilateral, impose tariffs on other countries. Now, I think the principles are there in the trade agreements, but I don't think that the United States is really, in spirit or in reality, really abiding by these principles. I think what they're seeing this as a power play, and right now they're willing to negotiate and make concessions because China has a strength, right? China is able to control the rare earths, and China is also able to, in a way, affect the global supply chain that I think the United States would have to pay attention to, right? Inflation rate now is 2.7% in June, which is up by, from 2.4% in May. And the US's GDP contracted in the first quarter. The US dollar weakened, the US government yield has jumped up. All of this because of these tariff war. So I think, even in philosophy, as you just mentioned earlier, that Trump sees the trade as a problem, as a zero-sum game. The economic reality tells the difference. And sooner or later, I think Trump would have to, heed attention to this economic reality. And also, I think last point that I want to make is, China is still holding up. China's exports actually jumped by 5.8% in the first 6 months. China's exports to the United States have declined by 10.7%, but its exports to ASEAN countries has gone up by 13%, to EU has gone up by 6.9%, to Africa has gone up by 21%. So what it means is the rest of the world is going to move on. So the United States would have to be part of it, or it's going to be on the sideline.
And Sourabh Gupta, to Yan Liang's point, the message that's sold to the American public is all these countries are opening up their wallet and more money is coming into the U.S. coffers and all of that sort of thing. But the bottom line is it is the consumer in the end that has to pay for it. How come that message really hasn't sunk in with the American consumers just yet?
Up to a point, it has begin to sink in on his management of the when polled on Trump's management of the economy, including on tariffs, it's more or less pretty negative. Second, we have to understand that many of the tariffs, some of the tariffs have kicked in, but most of the tariffs were paused. And therefore, the real effect of the tariffs have not been felt. Of course, I mean, now that we have deals, the full effect of those tariffs will not be felt. But there will be an increase. We're seeing it even with the Federal Reserve. They don't know the direction of interest rates, of inflation, whether it's going to go down, it's going to go up, and therefore they're holding back on in terms of where they're going to go with their interest rate policy. And so right now we are in that phase of uncertainty. I think Mr. Trump himself knows about that uncertainty. That's why he's trying to get as many of these deals done as quickly as possible. But at the end of the day, there's no working around it. There is going to be a persistence of inflationary trends as a result of these tariffs, which will hurt American consumers and consumers worldwide up to a point. And this will show in how interest rates get played out and its economic effects. And so Mr. Trump has particular ideas on trade which very few subscribe to, but he is now showing that how he has been able to use the tariff lever to open markets and get a whole lot of investment in the U.S. And so that's how he is playing this game to the American consumer. But the American consumer will be bitten by tariffs at the end of the day.
John, it's interesting. I was reading a lot about trade today in preparation for the show. I was reading that trade agreements are now about 10 times longer than they were a quarter century ago. Really complex, very detailed. And of course, it's not just about what's going on today. It's looking into the future and all of that. Just how complicated are these deals, and what's a realistic expectation when you take the two largest economies, sit them down to hash things out? I mean, when could we expect an agreement, do you think?
I think we'll get the basics, the baselines of an agreement fairly quickly, but you're right, they're very long form at this point, which is a shame. I mean, trade agreements shouldn't even be agreements. It should be accepted that people produce in order to import, and they should be free to import from wherever they want, anywhere in the world. And, you know, talking about some of the previous points, if you want investment in your country, the best way to do it is to take in the world's plenty. Because when you're dividing up with the work with the world, it's just the same as dividing up work with people next to you on the same street, same town, same country. You're more productive, and you're more productive because you're specializing. Everyone knows this. And so the beauty of China embracing market economics in the last few decades is that we have many more hands working alongside the American people. And so it's a shame that we're going the route of tariffs simply because we're seeking tariffs at the same time that we're asking countries around the world to invest in the United States. Well, the U.S. has never required forced investment, and it never has, because the whole world wants its savings here because we're the best return, or at least historically the best return in the world. So if you want investment, if you want inflows of capital, keep your markets open, and the rest of it will take care of itself.
John, we've got probably about a minute left. I want to ask you the final question. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick insisting that President Trump's deadline of Friday to impose tariffs on a slew of countries will not be delayed any further. What do you think we can expect on Friday?
I don't think we can expect that, and here's why. The market's already telling us not to expect that. Deep down, one of the reasons markets have not corrected in response to all this brinksmanship is that everyone knows in the end that Trump, to his credit, wants his administration to be judged on the direction of the stock market. Would it that every president were that way? Stock markets love free trade simply because stock markets love productivity and specialization, and the only way to get that at its height is with free trade around the world. And so they will delay it. They will do whatever they can to avoid actual, really economy-crushing tariffs, because if Trump does that, the whole raison d'etre of his administration is eviscerated. What no one inside the administration will admit is what's true. They need free trade more than anyone.
And so this deadline is elastic in your estimation?
I think so, without question.
All right. Well, I want to thank all our guests for joining us. It's been a great discussion, talking a lot about trade this evening. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C.